Thanks for tuning into Upward Way podcast. If you're looking to be spiritually blessed, moved, and inspired, there is no doubt you are in the right place. On our show, guests recount their encounter with Christ and how their lives have been transformed through the grace and love of God. And now, please welcome our host.
Hello and welcome to Upward Way. I am your host, Marlon Walters. Today, my guest is a communicator, storyteller, author, and preacher of God's Word. David Edgren, welcome to Upward Way.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here speaking to you today.
Yes, I'm more than delighted to have you as a guest on the show. And I must say to the audience that they will be excited to learn, as much as they can from you, because you are indeed a true storyteller. So I wanted to start, David, with a little about your faith journey. If you could just give a little summary as to where and when your faith journey began.
I can't remember the beginning because it was when I was a child. My mom and dad, when they got married, were not Christians, but my mom had decided when she was a child herself that when she became an adult, she was going to go to church, and she was going to go to the Seventh-day Adventist church. So when she told her husband, my dad, that he said, "What's a Seventh-day Adventist?" And she said, "Well, it's the church that my grandmother goes to, and she takes me to camp meeting every year, and I want to go to that church because I want to go to camp." We were Adventists and we became Christians. I was about 2 or 3 years old when they started going to church. So I don't remember not being a person of faith, but I do remember, I remember growing in the faith with my parents because they would ask questions as much as we would, because when we would go to church, we were all learning together. So it wasn't like we were being told as children, this is what you have to be like to be a follower of Jesus. We were all learning it together. So it was a family endeavor to learn to be followers of Jesus in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. My dad was actually a Baptist minister's son, but my dad had left the church, the Baptist church, years before, and his father had had a nervous breakdown years before that. So they had not been really active. He hadn't been active in church for a long time. So it wasn't until my mom said she wanted to go to church and wanted to be an Adventist that he was interested. And he took a few more years after she started going to church before he joined her. So I think I was about 5 or 6 when my dad started coming along.
That's very important. The point you reference about your parents actually taking you to church. In some cultures, that is it, where the parents will send the children to church, they stay home, or sometimes it's the reverse, where the parents are also religious, but the children are actually neglected. So from your experience, what would you say are some of the values of having your children or allowing your children to have that early foundation in the faith?
Oh, it's so important. And it's really important for them to have what we call intergenerational worship, which means the kids don't go off to their church while the adults are in their church. A lot of churches do it that way. And when you sit next to your parents at church, you learn to see how they're perceiving God's word, and you see how your older siblings are perceiving it, and they see how you're perceiving it, and you're all learning together. And when you separate all up, what tends to happen, the one good thing about separating up is they can fine tune how they produce the program, so they can make it really good for kids, or really good for youth, or really good for elderly people or middle-aged people, whatever. But when they do intergenerational worship, you learn to appreciate each other, and largely right across the board in every denomination, they lose their youth. When they get to maybe 18, 19 years old, they're just gone. They're not in church anymore. And the reason is because, well, one of the reasons is because there's this connection of churches for me, they fine tune it. And as kids, they do a really good job of fine tuning church. So it really aims at us. And then when we become adults, we go, oh, I don't want to go to the boring church. I want a fun church like youth church and like teen church. And so learning to sit in what we would call the boring church helps us to recognize that church is not about us. You know, I heard a pastor one time, somebody came out and said, I didn't get anything from the sermon. And the pastor said, oh, it's a good thing we weren't worshiping you. And the the goal of going to church is not for you to be bells and whistles super happy all the time, but to worship God. And so when we do that together, intergenerationally, we call it, which means all the generations together as a family, we grow together in faith. And that's what my little family did when I was a little kid, because we were all literally growing together in faith. But we just happened to go to a church, the Seventh-day Adventist church, that does intergenerational worship every single Saturday. And so we learned together. And I never left the church because it was always something for more than just me. And it was always about God first and then about us.
Wonderful. As you mentioned, you never left the church. A friend of mine would say, people say they leave the church, but it's not that they have left, it's that the church has moved on ahead of them. But
Yeah,
those are
yeah.
powerful points that you have really just highlighted. Now, as it relates to growth, because that's what you have highlighted, the importance of growth, or the result is actually growth. So what it is you would say has resulted in that growth that you have experienced. So when we think about life, we think about investment, academic investment, and if you exercise, you put hours in the gym, etc. But sometimes people neglect, to invest enough in their faith. So for your experience, David, what has been the source of your spiritual growth?
I think, well, I know it's been other people, and having people that I can go to and talk to. And my parents were those people sometimes, but sometimes the questions were more questions for my pastor, questions for my youth pastor at church or at school. And I think, yeah, and sometimes questions for my friends, like, why do you guys do it like that and we do it like this, and you could bounce ideas off of each other. But as far as making choices, making changes in my life based on those questions and those choices, that really comes down to prayer. And so it's a communication as well between me and God, but also um, trying it. And this may sound really strange to say about faith, but faith is an experience, just like any other experience. And so, if you're not sure if something is for you, as long as it's not downright evil, if you just say, "Should I wear this or wear this to church?" Try both and see how you feel in them. See how your experience with other people is while you're wearing that. That's just a random illustration, but with everything in faith, for me, when I would talk to other people and then I would say, now I'm going to test it. And it's kind of like throwing that fleece out there and see, does it come back wet or dry? Is it good for me or not so good for me? Do I feel right with God while I'm doing this, or do I not feel right with God? And grow slowly like that. Faith shouldn't be a hurry. Faith, God gives us rest every 7 days, a whole day of it, because faith is a slow, methodical, healthy, restful process of maturity. And, it takes 20 years to grow up. Well, some people would say men aren't grown up till they're 35. But, it takes a while to grow up, and it's the same as spiritually. And we all make mistakes. I've made horrible mistakes, and those too have shaped me. They say suffering builds resilience. Suffering builds strength. Just like you were talking about going to the gym before, the purpose, this sounds terrible to say, but the purpose to go to the gym is to tear muscle. Because when you tear that muscle, it heals. And when it heals over the top of the muscle, it gets stronger. And you get bigger muscles and stronger muscles. And the same thing happens spiritually. You put yourself through a bad decision. You make a bad decision and you get torn away from the good, and you have to heal and you have to pray and you have to spend time talking to people to re-heal again, and your spiritual muscles get stronger. And you wouldn't wish that on anyone, but we all know that the struggles we've gone through in life have made us stronger people. And that's why stories are so powerful, because stories can tell the journey that you've taken, from the beginning of an experience to the end of it, and those decisions in between that were either good or bad. But there's learning in all decisions, really.
You say try it, and as you say try, I know you mentioned that people have been instrumental, but one Bible verse says, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." So if you don't taste, you don't really know what's happening there.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, I did introduce you as a storyteller, and when I did some research about your life, I realized that you have written not one, not two, but quite a few books. So,
More than I can hold in one hand. I think there's 11 of them published now, but they're all small. They're children's books, most of them.
yes, so you have to be a good storyteller to be able to write children's books. So, what was it that, I don't want to use the word catapult, but what was it that launched you into writing children's books?
I have been telling stories to children since I was a child. I remember when I was 12 years old, as I was coming out of church, I had a pastor who was a risk taker, and he said, David, one day you're going to be preaching the sermon in this church. And I just laughed at him, and he goes, actually, what would you think of dressing as a Bible character and telling the story from the perspective of, then we chose one. And so I said, well, yeah, I could do that, but I couldn't preach a sermon. And so he coached me. And after a few months of preparation, I got up and I told the story of the prodigal son. And, the prodigal son is this kid who asks his dad for half of his money and says, it's basically, he says, I want to pretend like you're dead. I want my inheritance now. And he takes that inheritance and he goes to a far place and he just wastes it all. And when he's there and he's got nothing left and there's poverty in the land and they're in famine, and he's actually working for a pig farmer and he's in the slop and he's eating the pig's food, he realizes the servants in my father's house have it way better than me. If I just go home as a servant, not as a son, I blew that, but I'll go home as a servant and I'll say, Dad, just accept me as a servant. I'll be eating better than this. And so he lifts himself out of the mud and he works his way out of the pig pen and he starts walking home and he's preparing his speech as he's walking. And the Bible has this, Jesus is telling it. It's not a true story in the sense that it happened, but it is true in the sense that it happens over and over with each of us as we come back to God. And Jesus says, so this son, this prodigal, this wanderer, he comes back home, and as he's walking, he's practicing his speech. Father, forgive me. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And he just keeps practicing this over and over and saying, let me live with the servants. And when he gets to the fence line and he's down, way down because it's a property, and his dad sees him from the front porch, and his dad just starts running. And the boy's like thinking, oh no, I'm in trouble. Here he is. My dad's running at me with a stick. But dad's running towards him with his walking stick. And when he gets there, he throws the stick aside and he wraps his arms around his son and he hugs him with this big embrace. And he starts trying to say his speech, Father, forgive me, for I've sinned against you and I've sinned against God. And his dad just puts his hands over his mouth and says, stop, 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 stop. No, you're my son. And by then the servants have caught up, and he's like, you get sandals for his feet. Look at my son's barefoot. You get clothes for my son and take him in and give him a proper bath. You get a ring for his finger so that he is my son again. And they would sign things back then rather than with their initial. They would sign it with their ring. They would stamp the ring into the wax, And so and then the fourth sermon, you go and kill the fatted calf, because tonight we're celebrating. We're having a party because my son is found. My lost son is found. My dead son is alive. We are partying tonight. And so you have this son come in. And so I'm telling this story as a kid. I'm 12 years old, and I'm telling it from his perspective. And as I've been preparing for the story, because I had a good pastor who coached me and discipled me through telling the story, helped me really dig into the story as, inductive Bible study before I created this, how I was going to tell it. I was talking to everyone about it. I can't wait. I'm going to be telling the story at church. It's going to be so much fun. And my uncle, my mom's brother, remember my mom was never a Christian until she became married. She he lived across town from us. And one time I was hanging out at his place, probably playing Atari 2600. I don't know if you remember that. And we're playing games together. And then I said to him, I'm telling a story at church. And he goes, "You're what?" Because you're just a kid. And he goes, "Yeah, I'm doing the sermon, man. I'm telling a story." And my uncle said this. "I wouldn't normally go to church, Davy, but if you're doing this story, I will come and listen." And my uncle came and he sat in the audience. And when I got to the part where the son looks up and he sees his father running, and he starts being scared that his father's going to be angry at him and he's going to punish him, and tears start, like building up in him. He's terrified because his father's running at him. I looked out in the audience, and my uncle, my grandfather, my uncle's father, was abusive. He hit people with sticks. He chased his kids around and punished them harshly. And so when this son was embraced by his father, I looked up at the audience and I looked in my uncle's eyes, and he was crying. Tears were just coming down his face. And he had understood right then the gospel. He had understood what God says he did for us by opening the gate and saying, "If you come home, I will embrace you. I have paved the way for you to come home." And this is what, Jesus tells a story, and he doesn't say this is the story about a runaway son. He says, "Let me tell you the story about a father, and it's about God." And Jesus says, "This is how I know my Father to be. Come home, all of you." That feeling, Marlon, when I saw my uncle crying, I was only 12 years old, but I just said, whatever just happened, I'm doing that. That is what I'm going to do with my life. Because I could have never spoke to my uncle and helped him to understand the gospel by telling him what I thought. But I could tell him a story, and he was sold, sold on the gospel. And I wish I could tell you that my uncle became a Christian and followed God. And I don't even think to this day that he has, but what I do know is he knows the gospel now, and he knows that God loves him like a father who welcomes his son home, not like a father with a stick who's angry. So that's how I became a storyteller. And I've been doing it ever since. I've done week of prayers for schools. I mean, Adventist schools. While I was a student myself in schools, I would go to a different school and do the week of prayer. And then when I got into university, I did a week of prayer for a school, and then I took a year off to go and be a volunteer at a school for a year. And that was when I was at Pacific Union College in California, and that school was here in Australia, and that's how I ended up in Australia. Because my wife went to the same school that I came over as a volunteer, and I met her as a visiting student, and she was there 12, and we dated for quite a while that year, and we got married the next year. So yeah, basically, my life is the product of the stories that I've told. I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for the fact that God made me into a storyteller.
Yes, stories that we want to hear. And when I listened to you, I realized that was what Jesus did. He told stories. And
Absolutely.
his stories were simple, but they were direct. And so the audience, when they listened to him, what his message was always clear, and they realized, oh, so when the scribes and Pharisees speak, there is so much pomp and pride, and they couldn't digest that. But when Jesus spoke, they were able to follow. And I think more of us actually need to develop that skill of telling stories. So that's in excess of, about 30 decades of you telling stories. So I want to ask about, challenges that we face in our lives at times as Christians. What would have been maybe one of the greatest challenges you would have faced, whether with sharing stories or others in your life, and then what has been your strategy for overcoming life's challenges?
My greatest challenge, without a doubt, is why I'm no longer a minister. I was a pastor for 15 years, and when I was 15 years in the ministry, I had an affair. And in that terrible decision, it tore me to pieces. Even in the middle of it, I knew it was wrong, and I knew what I was doing was destroying potentially everything. Certainly, if they ever found out, it would destroy my job, which is exactly what happened when they found out, and I deserved to lose my job for that. But when I came home, we had just been moved, and so as a pastoral team, my wife and I and our children had been moved, so we'd moved house, and I came home to her and I said, we need to go on a drive because I need to talk to you. And so while we were on this drive together, I said, I lost my job, and she said, what do you mean? They just moved us here. And she said, they can't do that. And I said, yeah, they can. And she said, well, where are we going now? And I said, nowhere. I don't work for the Adventist church anymore. They fired me. She said, they can't do that. And I said, yes, they can because I had an affair. And my wife heard both of those things in the same conversation. And I do not know to this day, Marlon, and it's been 13, 14 years now. I don't know how her next sentence was this, but her next words out of her mouth were, what are we going to do? She didn't say, get out. She didn't say, well, what are you going to do? Or how are you going to fix this? She said, what are we going to do? And when I heard the word we, I said that just out loud to her back. I just said, we. I said, I thought you would like kick me out. And I said, I deserve it. And just like the church kicked me out, I deserve to be kicked out of my family. I did like, it was terrible what I've done. And I feel like I need to be judged basically. And she said to me, and Marlon, I don't know to this day. I know she processed it for a long time afterwards because she wasn't ready for this conversation. But she said to me, when Jesus died on the cross, he died, and she said this literally in the car. She said this, and it just to me, just to this day, I'm like, really? How do you do that so quickly? But she said, when Jesus died for on the cross, he died for all the sins in the world. And all he asks us to do is forgive those who sin against us. And she said, surely this is what he means. I don't know how she did that, but I just burst into tears because I had been teaching the gospel since I was 12 years old. And I told that story to my uncle. I had been preaching the gospel. I had been writing the gospel in books. I had been doing gospel ministry my whole life. And when my wife said that, I realized it wasn't until this moment. I didn't realize it then. It wasn't until that moment that I'd experienced the gospel. But it wasn't until later that I was thinking it through that I realized, because I just burst into tears and it just broke me with joy and agony and suffering. And it took years for me to become whole again emotionally and my spiritual journey. But the one thing that didn't take years was relationally, because my wife welcomed me back instantly. And she wrapped her loving arms around me and she said, the only way that you're going to get rid of me is if you tell me to go away. She said, we all make mistakes. We all sin against God and against each other. But we should forgive each other particularly when we're sinned directly against by someone we love. The opposite of love is forgiveness. We should forgive or the result of love should be forgiveness if we've accepted the forgiveness of Christ. And so I've taken years to process that. And people ask me now, would you like to be a minister again? And I said, oh, I would love it. And they said, do you think you would be like as good, or would you be better? I would be way better because my entire strategy for ministry would have nothing to do with performance. So I was a great storyteller. You've heard me tell stories now. I love telling stories and I'm good at it. And so I pat myself on the back afterwards. Yeah, I know. People say you're a good storyteller. Thank you. I know. And I try not to brag on myself too much, but I've grown up with that my whole life, being an exceptional communicator. And when I fell at the foot of the cross because of what my wife said to me, I fell before her. And I mean, I fell. And then she picked me up from that position and she said, look up, you're well, you're saved. And then I realized that's what it's like to fall at the foot of the cross. And I love now talking to people like this and telling that story. So many people say to me, how can you tell that story? You shouldn't tell that story. That's terrible. I say, how can I not tell that story when I can tell you the amazing power of Christ's forgiveness, that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. We didn't just commit adultery against him. He uses that metaphor in the Old Testament. We did all the sins. We as a people destroyed our relationship with God. And he said, I come to die for you, not because of who you are, but because of who I am. I forgive you because you are my chosen, my beloved, and you're mine. And that to me is, it's so much more powerful. That understanding and helping people have that understanding through conversations. And I find nowadays, I used to save my stories until I had a crowd because I wanted to perform. Nowadays, one-on-one is the best because that's when I can really say to myself, are they getting it? Did I see their eyes light up? Did I see them lean forward? Did I see them open their stance towards me and say, I'm understanding what you're saying? Because then I know the gospel is doing its work. So that is my greatest suffering, that story. But it's also my greatest joy when I look down through it. In Hebrews 12:2, where it says, Christ, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. That's what it's talking about. He endured the cross because he knew that we were set before him, that he was going to have us, that we were going to be included in his kingdom. And so he looked, and then it says, so let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, who began our faith and will finish it. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the Father of God. That's the power of the gospel. That's what happens when we accept that Jesus has a purpose for our life, and he can use anyone. He uses who he chooses. He doesn't use you because you're qualified. He what's the word, the phrase that they say? He doesn't
He doesn't call the
it's just
qualified, he qualifies the called.
that's it. And far too often I think we feel qualified when really we should just rely on our calling, because
The
that's when
po-
we're doing what he's called us to,
so
I
as you
think.
were saying that God doesn't call the qualified, but he qualifies the called, and your story packages nicely the power of forgiveness and also the power of the gospel. It's really a lot to say unpack.
I'm still unpacking it, brother.
Yes, but I do agree with you that, sometimes it's best to share actually these things, because one of the things I realize as you point out forgiveness, that the persons you would hurt, whether deliberately or incidentally, they forgive you, they move on, but others, they can't move past your past. And so when you share that experience, they can't use it as a psychological weapon to say, oh, here's David talking about telling stories, and this is what he did in the past. You're putting it out there so they can't have that over your head. So I want to jump now into the stories that you share in your books. I was privileged to have been introduced to one of your books. I think it's The Perfect Lamb. I started going
Yeah.
through it, but I was really amazed by the simplicity of the story and the richness of it. So if you could just share with us, maybe all or some of the books you have written, and then just give a little.
I can give you an overview pretty easily because I do
Yes.
pretty much the same thing in all my kids' books. Um, I take a character, a kid, a child, and then I write a Bible story from their perspective. And so to do that, you have to think like a child. You have to ask questions like a child. And the way I started writing books for children was I did this thing when you're preparing a sermon that's going to be narrative, you do what's called inductive Bible study. And it's actually it's my favorite kind of in Bible study anyway, which is you go inside of the text and you say, what's happening around the text? So you ask questions of the context of the verse, what's the verses around it or the passages around it. Then you ask questions about the world that those characters are living in. So you're asking the context of the characters in the story, and you're learning about that, and you're inducting yourself into the story and then looking out from within. And in the first three books that I wrote, it's a series that Pacific Press published. They call it the Bible story series. I can't remember, but anyway, I call it the scroll series because the titles are the Lamb Scroll, the Serpent Scroll, and the Kingdom Scroll. And what happens in each one of them is three kids who are based on my three children. They get pulled inside of the Bible, and when they land inside the Bible, it's a blank page. And then they have to inductively remember what was on this page, what were we reading about, and when they say, "Oh, wasn't there a tree?" And then boom, there's the tree in the Garden of Eden. Oh, wait, there was a snake in the tree. There's a snake in the tree. And once they've got enough of it that they remember what story it is, the whole world populates around them. they can walk through it, but they can't change it. They can ask questions of it, but they can be seen, they can see the world they're in, but they can't be seen by the characters in the world. It's just like when we go read the Bible as adults. We can look into it, and the more and more and more we get to know the history and the context and the culture, the more we can feel like we're there, but we can't walk up to Adam and Eve and ask them a question. But we can walk up and listen to them talk if the words are in the scripture. And with sanctified imaginations, we can even say, what if they talked about this? How would they talk about that? And so my experience with writing books has been very much creating narratives that take other people on the journey of doing inductive Bible study. So the scroll books are based on, they're three little kids from our time now. And my children are Cyrus, James, Michael, Cyrus Paul is my son, and then Michael James is my second son, and then Rachel Hannah is my third child. And I took their middle names, so I have Paul, James, and Hannah are the three characters in the book. So one of the hardest things to write a book really well is to develop your characters, because you have to know these fictional characters really well in order to make them seem real. Well, I knew them really well because they're my children. And so I was able to, when I was writing these books, my kids were in primary school. So I was able to imagine what my kids would say in that situation. So my kids go on an adventure through the Bible three times, once in each of these books. The first time they chase the word serpent through the Bible, and they start with the serpent in the tree, and they finish with the great red dragon in Revelation, and they get the gospel in the middle. And so they get the whole picture of the Great Controversy. So the first book is the Great Controversy for kids. The next book, the Lamb Scroll, is the Gospel for kids. So they start out and they see the sacrificial system. They see Jesus, the Lamb who would give his life for the world, and they see in Revelation again the Lamb who gave his life and were saved by the blood of the Lamb. And it's all told in safe ways for children, but they jump from Bible story to Bible story. And I've had the editor here at Signs, his favorite scene in that book is when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, because the way that I imagined the conversation as they were having this conversation just really touched his heart. So he's an adult, but he read the book and he said, that scene just made me love Jesus. And I thought, that's cool. That's what we should be able to do when we tell stories and write stories about Jesus. And then the final one is the Kingdom Scroll, which is about being the church. It's about being in the kingdom now that we've been accepted. We've accepted God and we're part of his kingdom. And so it's leaping through kingdom stories in the Bible, getting to the eternal kingdom in heaven and the journey that we're on. So those were the first three. Those were the hardest ones to write. The next ones, the one you mentioned, The Perfect Lamb, it's just one kid's experience. So The Perfect Lamb is when Jesus is carrying his cross and it gets too heavy for him and he falls, and they call a man out of the crowd. They say, Simon, you come. And they say Simon wasn't from Jerusalem, he was from Cyrene. And then there's this little tagline in one of the Gospels that says, he was the father of Rufus and Alexander. Never anywhere else in the Bible do we hear about Rufus and Alexander, but their father carried the cross. So I took the Rufus and I made him this little boy, which he would have been, but he had a lamb, and his father had to, the reason his father was in Jerusalem was he was making a sacrifice for his family. So he would have had to take a lamb. And I told the whole scenario of what they did to fall in love with this lamb in Jewish families. They didn't just pick a lamb randomly out of the herd. They would pick the most beautiful lamb right after they'd had all the lambs born for that season. And then they would take the most beautiful one and they would take it into their home. And that lamb would live with them as a pet, and they would feed it from their hand, and they would cuddle with it while they slept. And that lamb was like a family member. It was loved. And so when they made the sacrifice for their sins, it mattered. The whole family felt it because they were losing that lamb that they'd offered everything all of their love to. Now, because of their sin, they were sending that lamb to die to pay the price. And it beautifully represents Jesus when he's on the cross, and their father is trying to figure out a way to tell them that when he was in the temple, he didn't see the lamb get sacrificed because there was this darkness and whatever. And as he's carried the cross, and he's there and he watches Jesus crucified. And then he hears the Roman soldier say, surely this man was the Son of God. And then he walks home and he gets there, and Rufus is sitting on the front step, and the little lamb, I named him Sammy in the book, and Sammy is sitting in Rufus's lap, which is impossible because he's just been sacrificed, right? But in one of my favorite books about this, on the Desire of Ages, the lamb jumps down off the sacrifice when the darkness happens and runs out of the city of Jerusalem. So I said, okay, that's Sammy. So Sammy gets out, he runs out through and he runs all the way home in the darkness. And when the lights come back on, he's at the end of the driveway and he goes, "Bleh," and little Rufus looks up and he goes, it's Sammy, but it can't be Sammy. And so now, as dad's walking home trying to say, what am I going to tell my kids just happened in Jerusalem when I saw Jesus, that great storyteller, die? And Sammy's sitting, Rufus is sitting holding Sammy on the front porch, and he's going, what am I going to do when dad gets home? How am I going to tell him this is Sammy, but without letting him take Sammy to sacrifice him tomorrow? What are some ways that I can keep Sammy? What happened? Maybe. What's the best case scenario? So when his dad walks up and his dad says, and he's still stumbling over his words and he's trying to figure out a way to say this that's kid safe, that Jesus was crucified. And Rufus is there holding lamb, and he said, Dad, how did Sammy get home? And he goes, that's not Sammy, Rufus. I took Sammy to this morning. You know that. And he said, Dad, this is Sammy. Look, did something happen? Did Sammy get away from you? And he's like, no, I took him. I sold him at the temple, and he would have been sacrificed. And he said, Dad, I know this is Sammy. And then he says this key line. He said, Dad, did you find a better lamb? And his dad just realizes that's the way to tell the whole story, with it being kid safe. And he said, yes, Rufus, we all found a better lamb. And that's the gospel. That's what Jesus did for us on the cross. No longer did families have to raise lambs in their homes and fall in love with them and offer that sacrifice, because the Lamb of God who lives in our hearts, and it is the Father, that belongs to the Father in heaven. He went to the cross, not every time we sin, but once for all sin. And he gave his heart, his life, his everything for us so that we could be eternally with him. He who knew no sin became sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. It's an awesome story, but it's really fun to shorten that down and make it into a kids package and not do all the pulling apart and all the explaining. Each one of them have a little discussion guide in the back where parents can use it to run Bible studies with their kids. Just read a chapter a night, and they're all cliffhangers, and it's fun that way. The ones that are about kids in the Bible, the next one is about Rhoda, the girl that opens the gate for Peter. Turned that into a whole story about becoming a Christian. And then the other one is Just Believe, which is about the little girl named Talitha, who she's dying she does die before Jesus gets to her house. And, and they come out and they tell her father, don't worry the master anymore. Your daughter's dead. And Jesus says, just believe. And when they get there, just believes the line that his little daughter's been saying. Dad, just believe in Jesus. If you just believe, go ask Jesus to come heal me. And so he hears this word come out of Jesus's mouth, just believe, and so he does. And when Jesus gets there, he raises her from the dead. So yeah, all of the kids' books are kind of geared around storytelling with an inductive Bible study approach, getting into the middle of it and looking out and saying, what is this teaching me about the scenario, the scene, and then ultimately about God and his love for me. And then some of the other books I've written one called The New Church, which is about being a healthy Christian, nurture, evangelism, worship, NEW. If we're nurturing each other, we're evangelizing the world around us, and we're worshiping God, we're a healthy Christian. Doing all three of those takes your whole life. Nurture, evangelism, and worship. Then I have one called The 28 Stories, which is a Bible study guide for young people for baptism. And that one is still used by a lot of different conferences around the world for their Bible studies with youth. And then I have one called One Trip to Kenya, because I went to Kenya for 3 weeks, and it was such a moving experience that I wrote a book about orphans in Kenya and how my understanding of poverty was reshaped. And then let's see, what else do I have? I think that's pretty much it. I've written chapters in other books where they have they'll ask you, can you just write one story? And then they put it in a compilation of stories in like a Reader's Digest kind of book. And I've got a few books that I've been included in like that. But yeah, so I don't write that often. Like I haven't written a book for probably 5 years. But when I do write it, when I get an idea, and then I just dig into it, and then another book pops up. I have 4 books in my imagination right now. I want to write another triple series about the scrolls. I want the Lamb Scroll, the Kingdom Scroll, and the Serpent Scroll. I want to do 3 more themes from the Bible like that with my kids going adventuring in the Bible. And then I'm also doing one about Naaman, and the little girl that in his house. I call her Sophie, and so Sophie's story it will be coming out probably next year.
Yes, I'm actually looking forward to reading some more of those books. Actually, I have access to 3 of them already, so I'll be either reading and sharing with my children as well. But uh, a few ideas, just pop in my head or thoughts. So maybe let me address the first one, which might be more important to the audience. Where can they access? I mean, typically persons would say, go to Amazon, but do you have them available, let's say, in any bookstores? I know you said was
Yep.
it Pacific Press? You said that is a publisher?
Yeah, Pacific Press. The publishers that I work through are the ones that publish their books and then sell them in the Adventist Book Center or Adventist Bookstore, depending on the country you're in. They
Right.
call it the ABC here in
ABC, right?
Australia,
Yes.
Adventist Book Center. I think in America they call it something similar. Wherever Adventist books are sold, because we have a publisher pretty much in every major country, there's a publisher that publishes in their language. I actually have one of my books, That Perfect Lamb that you enjoyed, that's been translated into Romanian, and they used it as a sharing book where they just gave it away to people, and they gave it to the children in their churches and said, go and give this away to a friend. They gave away over 30,000 copies of that book, which is just beautiful. And then the Kenya One Trip to Kenya is being translated, just finished in Portuguese, and should be available in Adventist bookstores down in Brazil and South America. So yeah, sometimes they get translated into other languages as well. But if you go to your Adventist Book Center or however they sell books online, so in Australia we have a book thing called Hope. Is it called Hope Books, I think? And that's how the Adventist Book Center in Australia sells their onlines. But if you just type in Adventist Book Center or bookstores in my country and put your name of your country, you'll find them. If you can't find them because they're out of stock, just find me and I'll post you a book. I'm happy to. I have copies of some of them. I don't have all of them, but I can go buy one from my ABC and send it to you. And yeah, so that's how.
Yes, and Dave is not hard to find, and when you find him, he's not difficult to communicate with either. I must add that because sometimes you interface with folks, and they will say, "Yes, you can reach out to me," but you reach out and you're waiting 1 day, 1 week, 2 weeks, a couple months. But with Dave, it's almost as if he's waiting for you to respond. So
I always have a device like really close. If it's not my computer, which I'm often sitting at, it's my phone. And my phone, yeah, it's so easy now with the way that it gives you answers. It says, do you want to say yes, thank you? And you say, yeah, and then that's all you need to say, or see you then, those kind of things. And I'm pretty quick writing with my thumbs. So yeah, that's one of my promises I make to people. If you write to me, I will write back. If I don't know the answer, I will write back and tell you that. I don't know the answer, but I will find it for you. Because as a communicator, there's nothing that I've learned about communication that's more important than communicate. You answer people, tell them you exist. And if you don't answer, if somebody sends you an email and you think, oh yeah, I should respond to them once I know all the information, they don't know you've read that email. until you say, I read your email. Thanks for that. I'm going to get the information for you. That's one of my favorite emails to get. I've got them from presidents of conferences all around the world, and I can tell the good communicators from the not good communicators because you'll get an answer, but I'll send one like about my new book or whatever, and I'll send it out to a bunch of presidents, and I'll get emails back from 4 or 5 presidents saying, thanks so much for this, Dave. Look forward to reading it when it comes out. That took them 12 seconds to write, but it makes a world of difference to me. So yeah, if you send me an email or WhatsApp or whatever, I will communicate with you. Um, and I'll tell you the same thing. If you ask for me for money, I don't have any. I have a lot of people that like to ask me for money. They think that's what the internet's for. And I say, I'm happy to give you time. That's what I have. God's blessed me with time and with the resource of creativity. And I'm happy to spend that on people, but I don't, God knows better than to give me money. I'll just waste it.
Actually, that point you made about communication, I would want to amplify it before I get to the maybe final 2 questions, because it's something that I personally have challenges with when I interact with folks. Of course, I'm never in any rush. I always tell my friends, with me, there's no rush. However, people will say they are busy, and I find that persons who are really busy never tell you that they are busy, but the ones who are not really busy, they like to drop that busy line. So I think, just as you say, the best way to communicate is just to communicate. So if someone sends a message, they're not asking you to tell them too many things, but say, okay, thanks, I've seen your message, or maybe later I will give a true response.
Yep.
But if you communicate, then you are actually making it possible for a relationship to form. And especially if we say we are people who want to share God's word, we have to really do better where communicating is concerned.
Yeah. And I mean, seriously, if we want to be entrusted with sharing God's word, we should be pretty good at just saying hello because that's simple. Sharing God's word takes time because you got to get to know that person and learn how to frame it so that it's so that it goes in. Because me saying it the same way to everyone, that's just means that I'm talking, that's me. That's focusing on me. This is how I tell the gospel. Where if I get to know you well enough to know, I know what will reach your heart, and then tell a story that connects through to where your love is, then you'll understand the gospel when I share it with you, rather than just saying, well, I told them the gospel. I don't know why they didn't listen. Listening is the first skill that we all must have as communicators. Listen well and then speak.
Yes, I did say 2 questions, but I'm going to end with one final question. So, there are individuals who may have, let's say, a similar passion, a similar interest in terms of producing religious content, whether it's going to be books, whether it's going to be CDs, whether it's going to be doing art. But I want to keep it a bit with book first. What advice would you give them? And as you said, you are published to the Adventist, let's say, book publishing house. So what advice would you give someone who is thinking of publishing, maybe it's a devotional, a children's series or whatever, and they'd like to do it through the Adventist publishing house? What should they do if they are so desirous? And then you could maybe give more generic response to other artisans who may want to just publish, create religious content.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is to be a great writer, you need to write. And that seems so simplistic, but it's true. If you say I want to write a book, we'll write a book.
Right.
Yes. If you want to write a book, write shorter things because you have to write chapters to write a book, right? And share what you write. Without being precious. In Australia, they use the word precious to mean overly protective. It doesn't just mean that it's special. Like if you say, oh, he's a bit precious about that, it means he doesn't share his writing with people because he thinks it's pretty special. And he thinks don't wait till you have a whole book to share the information. Start a Substack and write every chapter in Substack as a chapter and say, I'm looking forward to this maybe being a book one day, but I wanted to share it with you now. If you share everything, I've been doing this since the internet started. Everything I've written, I put up I have a blog, but I used to use that and be all my publishing, but now I've moved to Substack. but I put everything on there, even articles that I wrote for magazines, like for Adventist. I worked for the Adventist Publishing House here in Australia for 3 years as a pastor. And while I did, I just put everything on my blog as well. And sometimes I would get some feedback from people saying, "Hey, we paid you for that article." And so I would say, "Okay, I will take it off my blog and I will put the first paragraph and then I will link it to where you've put it on the internet." Because everybody publishes everything on the internet. And so then I would link through to their magazine. But the more you share your content, the more it raises your profile. And the more your profile gets raised, the more people know you as a writer and as a communicator. And then if you also like to speak, which doesn't always go together. Some people are great speakers and some people are great writers. And the two things together, I learned when I was an editor, actually don't happen very often. Usually you have somebody who's really good at research and writing, and you have somebody who's really good at talking. And those two things, I would get sometimes a manuscript to publish in Record or Signs, and it would be from a minister, and it would be so poorly written. I would say, surely they didn't preach this. But it's because when they start talking, they change it to be what they want to say. But when they write it out, they just don't have wordcraft skills. And that's fine. But the way to build those skills is to do it more and more and more. So that's the main tips I would give. To be a writer, you have to write. Don't be precious with your writing. Put it everywhere. Put it on your blog, put it on your Substack, give it away for free. And Substack has a nice little thing. You can make it free, but you can also have a subscribe button that people, if they really like your writing, they can say, "I want to give back to this guy." And I have my subscription on Substack at $7 a month. I have one subscriber that pays $7 a month. And there's hundreds of people that read everything that I write on Substack. Doesn't bother me because I write it because I love to write, and then I share it. So write, share, and raise your profile. And then when you actually want to get something published from a local Adventist publishing house, unfortunately, it is who you know. So you need to get known by the associate editor, the assistant editor, the editor, depending on your country. Some countries are small. That's what's great about Australia. There's not very many Adventists here, so you can get to know the editor quite well, quite easily. And when I was the associate editor there, a lot of people would call just to talk to me, and I would just chat with them for a little while. I could do that because it's not as like you said, busy. Busy is the worst four-letter word in the English language. That's my saying. If you say I'm busy when somebody says, "Can I have some, yeah, are you
Applause.
busy?" Yeah, if somebody says, "Are you busy?" I say, never. I'm available." Because I can do what I was doing later. If you need me, I'm available. And that's to me, that's the greatest thing I can give to someone else is my time. So yeah, writing's easy as far as you just have to write. Being published is a difficult process. And some people write fantastic books and are never published by a publishing house. But if you want to self-publish a book, it's so easy now online. You can write your book. You can actually send it to editors. The Philippines has really good editors that are very cheap, and they'll send your book back edited. They'll even publish it all the way for you. Or you can use Amazon has a really good book publishing process that you just run your book through it and you just answer all the questions. You dump all your content in, you make it all look nice, and then you click publish, and it goes on to be an Amazon ebook. And then people can also click print and send me a copy, and it will literally print it there and send it to the person with a cover on it and everything, and it looks like a book from a bookstore, but it doesn't actually exist as a book until it's ordered. So the world's a different place nowadays. If you just want a book with your name on the cover of it, you can go down to a local photocopy place and make one. But yeah, writer's right. That's the key answer to it is just start writing and really enjoy the process of letting your thoughts become words on a page, and then edit it and craft it and do it because you love it, not because it's going to make a lot of money. Because I've written 11 books, and they've honestly the highest royalty check I've ever gotten a year was about $270 for the whole year. So you're not going to make a living doing it. But it feels nice to see. My favorite thing is when kids come up to me and say, "I read," and they tell you the book that they read. And I say, "What was your favorite part of the book?" And then they tell you. That's just so rewarding. So yeah, write for the joy of writing and sharing what you've written.
Powerful stuff. With YouTube, they will say like, share, subscribe, but you are saying write, share, have others subscribe to Substack to
That's
learn
it.
to read more of what you have written. Well, let me say thanks, David, for really coming on to share so much, so many stories and sharing your own personal life story. I'm trying to run through my head to do a bit of summary of what you have shared so far, but I can't. But I guess I could pull three things that you have shared is that your journey or your faith journey, while you can't recall when, at least when you were 5 and a bit older, you remember your parents, being taking you to church and the importance of worshiping together. Nowadays we have churches, we have the children's church, the youth church, and we have the adult church. But when everyone have that experiential worshiping together, then it's better because children can look at the parents or the adults, they can model
Mm.
their behavior. You also share, challenges that you'd have faced, or the major one. But the power of the gospel, the power of forgiveness would have been what would have, caused
Mm.
you to remain focused, and to
Yep.
realize that, yes, God is indeed real. And as you shared, for folks who want to do any kind of content, they want to share, don't keep it. What was the word of special?
Share.
Yes, but make sure you share. Back home, we'll say don't be stingy with it. Don't be
Oh,
don't think.
precious. Don't be precious with
Yes,
your
don't be
writing.
precious. Don't think it's so precious that you can't share, but share it, because by
Yeah.
sharing, that's how you will actually, I would say, master your skills and develop more. So thanks. But as is customary on this show, before we go, do you have any parting words to share with our listeners?
Well, I'd love to just give you a way to reach me. If you go to any of the socials, DAVEDGREN is my handle. So that's my name, Dave Edgren, but it's pushed together. So DAVEDGREN. If you do that at gmail.com, that's my email. If you do it at Facebook, that's me at Facebook. If you do it on Substack, that's me at Substack. It's all at Dave Edgren, and Instagram as well, YouTube as well. I have lots of free stories on YouTube. If you like stories, go and watch me tell stories all around the world. I have videos from all over the place. So yeah, and the message that I hope I've given you guys is stories are only worth something if you tell them. So if you have something happen to you, and it's too painful to tell, then work through it. But once you get to a point where you've worked through the struggle and it's become a blessing in your life because you've become stronger because of that suffering and that growth, share that story. Because in sharing it, what happens is you reframe it. As something bad happens to you, and you reframe it as this is what I learned from it. Every time you tell your own story reframed, it gets stronger and stronger in your mind that this was a good thing. It helped me. When something really bad happens, like you lose a child or something goes really wrong and you think there's nothing good out of this, over the years, you will be able to share that story or be able to come up to someone else who's lost a child and put your arm around them and cry with them. And that's a beautiful story, just that you were able to do that. As we do that and we share our story, share our suffering, and it becomes our strength, we become the people of God stronger and stronger and stronger until other people look at us from outside and say, I don't know what you guys have, but I want that. I see you talking with each other. I see you caring for each other. I see you sharing. I see you eating together. I see you praying together. I see you loving each other. How do I? How do I get that? And you say, just come, join us, and enjoy listening to our stories until you feel welcome and you feel open to share your own stories. And it's in the sharing of our stories that we become the people of God.
Praise the Lord. In sharing our stories, we become the people of God. Thanks for tuning in, or you've been in tune to Upward Way. Do join us again next week when we'll have another interesting guest sharing his or her story of faith. Please subscribe to weekly episodes on the Apple, AWR, Loud Voice, Spotify, or Podcast Guru apps. And you're welcome to go over to Upward Way Facebook page, Upward Way YouTube page. Click like, leave a comment. Until then, I'm Marlon Walters saying goodbye. May God
You've
bless
been
you.
listening to the Upward Way podcast, the #1 audio production show for people who want encouragement and reassurance in a muddled world.